Hey everyone, welcome back to Speak Up. I'm Ryan, your host, and I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Priya. If you're new here, Speak Up is where we have real conversations about challenges that all of us face in life and how to overcome them.
That's right, Ryan. And today we're tackling a topic that hits close to home for everyone: how to deal with failure and setbacks. Let's be honest, we all face failure at some point, whether in our careers, relationships, or personal goals.
Exactly. But here's the thing. We're not just talking about failure today. We're diving deep into practical ways to move past it and use it as fuel for growth. We've got some great stories, actionable tips, and strategies to help you turn setbacks into comebacks. Stay with us, because by the end of this episode, you'll be ready to face your failures head-on and come out stronger on the other side. So now that we're all geared up, let's jump into our first segment, facing failure head-on. This might sound obvious, but it's something so many of us struggle with. I know I have. The natural reaction when we fail is to downplay it or even pretend it didn't happen. But here's the reality. Avoiding failure only gives it more power over us. We all know that feeling of trying to brush off a failure, right? You convince yourself it wasn't that big of a deal, or you avoid thinking about it. But what happens? It sits in the back of your mind, festers, and starts affecting other areas of your life.
Exactly, Ryan. I've definitely been there. One of the toughest moments in my life was when I applied for what I thought was my dream job. I had gone through multiple rounds of interviews and really thought I had it in the bag. But when I got the rejection email, it hit me like a truck. And you know what I did? I ignored it. I didn't talk about it, didn't process it, just kept pretending it didn't bother me. But the truth is, that failure stuck with me for months. It made me question my abilities, not just in my career, but in other areas of my life too. I even started avoiding other opportunities because I was scared of failing again. Looking back, I realized that avoiding that initial failure made it 10 times worse.
And that's such an important point. The longer we avoid confronting a failure, the more power it gains. The first step in moving past a setback is to acknowledge it. Like, let's take a common example. Say you're a student who's just bombed an important exam. If you don't face the failure, if you just pretend it's no big deal or ignore it, that anxiety starts creeping into everything else. You might start avoiding your studies, your motivation drops, and before you know it, you're in a downward spiral. It's so easy to let one failure snowball into something bigger because we're scared to admit how much it hurts.
Right. And what we need to realize is that it's perfectly normal to feel hurt, disappointed, even embarrassed. But avoiding those feelings doesn't protect us. It actually holds us back. I think the most important thing is to give yourself permission to sit with that disappointment, even for just a little while. You can't skip the grieving process. For me, when I finally sat down and admitted to myself that losing that job opportunity really stung, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I wasn't running from it anymore. And from that place of honesty, I could start figuring out how to move forward.
That's such a great example. It reminds me of something I heard once. The only way out is through. You can't shortcut your way past failure. The more we try to ignore it, the more it impacts us mentally and emotionally. So, for anyone listening right now, the takeaway here is to face your failure head-on. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't minimize it. Own it. If you failed a project at work, admit to yourself that it stings. If a relationship didn't work out, it's okay to be sad. The key is to acknowledge those emotions without letting them define you.
Exactly, Ryan. And it's not just about feeling the emotions. It's also about setting a time limit for those feelings. Give yourself permission to grieve the setback for a day, a week, whatever feels appropriate. But then, at some point, you've got to decide to stop dwelling on it and take action. I think too many of us get stuck in the sadness or frustration for longer than necessary, and that's when failure really holds us back. So, make a commitment to yourself that once you've acknowledged the pain, you're going to move forward with purpose.
Absolutely. And here's a practical step for our listeners. Today, Take 15 minutes to confront one failure or setback you've been avoiding. Write down exactly how it makes you feel, whether it's disappointment, frustration, embarrassment. Be honest with yourself. The simple act of acknowledging it is the first step in loosening its grip on you.
Yes, it might sound simple, but it's incredibly powerful. It's like once you see failure for what it is, a single event, not a reflection of who you are, you start to reclaim your power. You're no longer running from it. You're facing it head on, and that's where the healing begins.
So true. It's not about pretending failure doesn't hurt. It's about owning that hurt and using it as fuel for growth. And that's where we're headed next. How to take that failure and turn it into something that works for you. But first, make sure you've done that first step. Face it. Don't sugarcoat it. We'll be right back after this short break. All right, now that we've talked about facing failure head-on, let's dive into the next step. Turning that failure into fuel. This is where we shift our mindset. Once you've acknowledged that failure hurts, it's time to use that experience to your advantage. You see, most people think of failure as the opposite of success. But the truth is, it's part of the same process. Failure is feedback. It's telling you what didn't work, and more importantly, what can work if you adjust your approach. What do you think, Priya?
Absolutely. This mindset shift was a game changer for me. After I faced that job rejection we talked about earlier, I started thinking, what is this failure trying to teach me? At first, it was tough because I felt like the failure meant I wasn't good enough. But once I reframed it, I realized that the rejection was feedback. Feedback that I needed to work on certain skills I hadn't developed enough. Instead of seeing it as the end of the road, I started looking at it as an opportunity to grow. I took online courses to sharpen those skills, and the next time I applied for a role, I was more prepared and confident.
Exactly. That's such a powerful example because it shows that failure isn't a wall. It's a mirror. It reflects back areas where we can improve. And when you start to look at failure as feedback, it completely changes how you approach setbacks. Let's say you're an entrepreneur who just launched a new product, and it flopped. You could either see that as the end of your business journey, or you could ask, what's this failure trying to tell me? Was it the wrong market? Was it the wrong message? Did I not put enough focus on user experience? That feedback is invaluable for the next step.
Exactly. And the beauty of this mindset is that it takes you out of the victim mentality. You stop feeling like the world is against you, and you start seeing how you can take control of the situation. There's a great quote I always come back to. Failure is a bruise, not a tattoo. It's temporary, and it's not a permanent mark on who you are. I think one of the most empowering things you can do is take the lessons from your failure and actively apply them.
That's a great way to put it. Failure as a bruise, not a tattoo. And I want to add that reframing failure doesn't mean ignoring the tough reality of it. You're still acknowledging that it was painful, but now you're looking at it with curiosity instead of shame. Like, what didn't work here, and how can I use this to my advantage? One example that comes to mind is Thomas Edison. We all know he famously said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." That's the kind of resilience we're talking about, seeing each failure as a step closer to the breakthrough.
Right, and imagine if he had given up after a couple of failed experiments. We wouldn't have the light bulb. But the reality is, most people don't have that persistence because they don't shift their mindset around failure. I've worked with people who are so afraid of failing that they avoid trying altogether. And that's one of the biggest obstacles to growth. If you can take one lesson from each setback, you're moving forward, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time.
Exactly. It's about progress, not perfection. And for our listeners out there, here's a practical step you can take right now. Think back to your most recent failure, no matter how big or small, and write down one key lesson you can take from it. Maybe it's a skill you need to improve, maybe it's about timing, or maybe it's about your approach. Whatever it is, find the feedback in that failure and use it to fuel your next step.
And once you have that lesson, put it into action. Don't just learn from failure, use it. If it's a skill gap, sign up for a course or ask someone for mentorship. If it's about timing, adjust your plans accordingly. The point is to take that feedback and let it guide your future decisions. It's all about shifting from feeling powerless to feeling empowered.
That's such a great point, Priya. Reframing failure as feedback gives you the power to shape your own path. And that's how failure stops being something to fear and starts becoming a tool for growth. It's about taking control of the narrative. You failed, sure. But what did you learn? And how are you going to apply it? That's how you turn failure into fuel. And we're going to dive even deeper into this in the next segment, where we'll talk about how to take responsibility for your failures without letting them define you. Stay tuned. All right, so we've talked about facing failure and reframing it as feedback. Now, let's move into something that's often a bit tricky: taking responsibility without letting failure define you. This is a big one. When we fail, it's easy to start thinking that the failure is a reflection of who we are, right? Like, I failed at this project, so I must not be good enough. But the truth is, failure is something that happens to you. It's not who you are.
Yes, and this was something I really struggled with when I missed a huge work deadline a few years ago. It was my responsibility to deliver, and when I didn't, it cost the company a client. I was devastated. For weeks, I kept replaying the failure in my head, thinking, I'm not cut out for this job. I'm just not good enough. I was letting that one moment define my entire worth. It wasn't until a mentor of mine sat me down and said, Priya, this mistake doesn't make you a failure. It's just a moment you can learn from. That hit me hard because I realized I was over-identifying with the failure itself.
And that's such an important distinction. Owning the failure means accepting that, yes, something went wrong, and you played a part in it. But it's crucial not to internalize it to the point where it defines your sense of self. I think a lot of us fall into that trap, especially when the stakes are high. Like, if you're leading a big project at work or running your own business and something tanks, it feels like your entire identity is wrapped up in that failure.
Exactly. And the key is to own your role in the failure, but separate your self-worth from it. For example, after missing that deadline, I had to sit down and really break it down. What part of this failure was in my control? Well, I didn't manage my time well, and I didn't communicate enough with my team. Those were areas I could improve. But what wasn't in my control? Some of the client's expectations changed midway through the project. Once I could clearly see what I was responsible for, I stopped blaming myself for things that weren't my fault.
That's such a practical approach, separating what you can control from what you can't. It reminds me of the serenity prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. When we can clearly see the line between the two, it becomes easier to own our mistakes without letting them crush us.
Yes. And let's not forget that owning the failure doesn't mean beating yourself up about it. It's about taking responsibility in a way that leads to growth, not self-punishment. It's easy to go down the path of negative self-talk. I always mess things up. I'll never be good enough. But those thoughts don't serve you. What serves you is asking, what can I learn from this, and how can I improve next time?
That's key. And for anyone listening right now, if you're stuck in that loop of self-blame, take a step back and write down two things. 1. What was in your control in this situation? And 2. What wasn't? Once you've got that list, focus only on the things you can actually improve moving forward. Let go of the rest. You're not doing yourself any favors by holding on to what you couldn't control.
And to add to that, try to separate the failure from your identity. Instead of saying, I failed, say, I experienced a failure. It sounds small, but it makes a big difference. It's a reminder that failure is a moment in time, not a permanent state of being. You are not your failures. You are someone who experiences them, learns from them, and moves forward.
Exactly. It's like that quote from Nelson Mandela, I never lose, I either win or learn. That's the mindset we need to cultivate. Take responsibility, but don't let the failure define your worth. And when you adopt this mindset, you'll find that you're more willing to take risks because you know that even if you fail, it won't diminish who you are as a person.
Right. And once you're able to separate yourself from the failure, you can focus on growth rather than perfection. It's liberating because you realize that failure is just feedback, not a reflection of your potential. You can make mistakes and still be valuable, still be capable of achieving great things.
That's such an important point. So, for those of you tuning in, the next time you face a setback, take ownership of the parts that are yours to own. But don't internalize the failure as part of your identity. It's a moment in time, not who you are. And coming up next, we're going to talk about how to rebuild your confidence after a failure. Because once you've separated yourself from the setback, the next step is getting back on track and stacking small wins. Now that we've talked about owning your failures without letting them define you, let's move on to something equally important: rebuilding your confidence. Once you've experienced a setback, it's easy to feel like your confidence is shattered. But here's the good news: you don't need to rebuild it all at once. You can do it step by step with small wins. I think we often overlook the power of these small victories, but they can be incredibly effective in getting you back on your feet.
Totally. After my big failure at work, the one I mentioned earlier, I felt like I was stuck in a confidence rut for a long time. I didn't want to take on any major responsibilities because I was terrified of failing again. But what really helped me was breaking things down into smaller, manageable tasks. Things I knew I could accomplish and feel good about. I started by taking on smaller freelance projects that I knew I could handle. Each time I finished one successfully, I felt a little more confident, and that slowly rebuilt my trust in myself.
That's exactly it. It's about stacking those small wins. When we experience a big failure, we tend to feel like we need to bounce back with something equally big. But that's where we get it wrong. You don't have to take on some massive challenge right away to prove yourself. Instead, focus on small, achievable goals that can give you a sense of progress. These little victories build momentum, and over time, they add up.
Right. And the thing about small wins is that they're not just about boosting your confidence in the short term. They actually remind you that you can succeed, even if it's in small ways. And that's what you need after a failure. Proof that success is still possible. For example, after losing that big client due to my missed deadline, I didn't try to land another huge account right away. Instead, I focused on completing smaller tasks, like organizing team meetings more efficiently or improving my communication with colleagues. Each small step gave me the confidence to tackle bigger challenges down the road.
Exactly. And for anyone listening who feels like their confidence has taken a hit, here's a practical tip. Pick one thing, just one thing, that you know you can do successfully today. It doesn't have to be big. It could be as simple as organizing your workspace, sending an email you've been putting off, or finishing a chapter of a book you've started. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you know it's something you can complete. Then, once you've done that, give yourself credit for it. It's about creating that sense of accomplishment, even in the smallest ways.
Yes, and don't underestimate the impact that small wins can have on your mindset. They start to shift your thinking from, I can't do this, to, wait, maybe I can. And each small success builds on the last. You start to regain trust in your abilities, one step at a time. I remember a time when I was working on a small project that, on the surface, didn't seem like a big deal. But completing it gave me such a sense of pride because I had been feeling so down after my previous failure. It reminded me that I could still contribute something valuable, even if it wasn't a huge achievement.
Exactly. And the beauty of this approach is that once you start stacking these small wins, they create a snowball effect. You gain a little more confidence with each win, and before you know it, you're ready to tackle those bigger challenges again. I know a lot of people get stuck because they're waiting for some grand comeback moment. But the reality is, those moments are built on the foundation of smaller successes. It's about progress, not perfection.
And let's be real, it's not about rushing the process either. Rebuilding confidence takes time, especially after a major setback. But if you focus on those small wins, the process becomes less overwhelming. It's like climbing a staircase. You don't jump to the top, you take it one step at a time. And every step you take is progress. For example, if you failed at a business venture, maybe your next step isn't to start a whole new business right away. Maybe it's to rework your strategy, talk to a mentor, or complete one part of your business plan. Each of those steps is a win.
Exactly. And let's not forget, rebuilding confidence is a journey, not a destination. You're going to have good days and bad days, and that's okay. The point is to keep moving forward, even if it's just a small step each day. So for all of you tuning in, take a moment today to identify one small win you can achieve. It doesn't have to be monumental, just something that reminds you of your capability. Then, tomorrow, do it again. Let those wins start stacking up.
Right. And if you've got a journal, try keeping track of your small wins each day. Write them down, no matter how small they seem. Over time, you'll be able to look back and see how far you've come. It's easy to forget the progress you're making when you're focused on the big picture, but those small steps really do add up.
Exactly, Priya. Progress is progress, no matter how small. And that's how you rebuild, slowly, steadily, but surely. So as we wrap up this segment, remember, it's not about making a giant leap. It's about taking consistent, small steps. In our next segment, we're going to talk about the people around you, your support system, and how the right people can help lift you up after a failure. Now that we've talked about rebuilding confidence through small wins, let's focus on something equally vital: the people around you. It's no secret that the right support system can make all the difference when you're trying to bounce back from failure. Surrounding yourself with the right people can either push you forward or hold you back, depending on who you let into your circle. When you're dealing with setbacks, you need people who believe in your potential, but more importantly, people who are constructive, not just critical.
Exactly, Ryan. I've experienced this firsthand. After my work-related failure, I realized that not everyone in my life was actually helping me move forward. I had a couple of people who, though they didn't mean any harm, kept reminding me of what went wrong, pointing out all the things I could have done better. It felt like they were keeping me stuck in that failure. It wasn't until I started distancing myself from those voices and surrounding myself with people who were focused on solutions, not just problems, that I really began to heal and move forward.
That's such a key point. It's not about cutting people out just because they criticize you. It's about making sure the criticism is constructive. There's a big difference between someone who points out where you can improve and someone who constantly reminds you of your failures without offering any way to move forward. And we've all been there, right? When you're already down, the last thing you need is someone reinforcing negative feelings or doubts.
Right. And it's not just about avoiding negative people. It's about intentionally surrounding yourself with people who will uplift you and push you to grow. I'm not just talking about friends and family, but mentors, colleagues, or even peers who are on the same journey as you. After my failure, I found so much value in talking to people who had gone through similar setbacks and come out stronger. They didn't just sympathize with me. They helped me see the light at the end of the tunnel and encouraged me to take actionable steps.
Exactly. And here's the thing. When you're going through a tough time, it can be tempting to isolate yourself, to keep things to yourself because you're embarrassed or afraid of judgment. But that's exactly when you need to reach out to the right people the most. Isolation can make setbacks feel much worse than they actually are because you're stuck in your own head, amplifying the negatives. On the flip side, surrounding yourself with people who believe in you reminds you that you're not alone, and it gives you the encouragement to keep moving forward.
Yes. And sometimes the right people can offer perspectives that you might not see on your own. When I was struggling with my confidence, my mentor pointed out strengths that I had completely forgotten about because I was so focused on my failure. She helped me remember that I was capable of achieving great things, but I just needed to approach the situation differently. Having that positive yet honest voice made all the difference in how I tackled my next steps.
That's such an important takeaway. The people around you can help you see things you're too close to recognize. And sometimes, they give you the courage to keep pushing, even when you feel like giving up. So for our listeners, if you're going through a setback right now, take a moment to think about the people you're surrounding yourself with. Are they helping you grow, or are they keeping you stuck in your failure? It's a tough question, but it's one that can make all the difference.
And here's a practical tip. If you feel like you don't have that support system in place, start seeking it out. Join a group of like-minded people, whether it's an online community, a professional network, or even a local meetup. Surround yourself with people who have experienced setbacks and overcome them, because they will remind you that failure is not the end of the road. And if you do have people in your life who are constantly bringing negativity, it's okay to create some distance. You don't have to cut them off entirely, but you need to protect your mental space, especially when you're in a vulnerable place.
That's such good advice. And let's not forget, it's not just about getting rid of negative influences, but actively bringing in positive ones. Whether it's a friend, mentor, or even a coach, surround yourself with people who inspire you to be better, even when you feel at your worst. They will hold you accountable, but they'll also be there to remind you that your setbacks don't define you. You might even find that just talking through your challenges with the right people will give you the clarity and encouragement you need to move forward.
Exactly. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation with the right person to completely shift your perspective. And when you start surrounding yourself with people who have your back and want to see you succeed, it becomes easier to shake off the negative voices, both from others and in your own mind. So for everyone listening, your action step for today is this. Take a look at your support system. Are the people around you lifting you up or holding you down? If they're lifting you up, lean into those relationships. If they're not, it might be time to reevaluate and create some distance. And remember, it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to go through setbacks alone.
We've discussed facing failure, reframing it as feedback, taking responsibility, rebuilding confidence, and surrounding yourself with the right people. Now, let's dive into the final piece of the puzzle: persistence. This is where all the steps we've discussed come together. The truth is, success doesn't come from avoiding failure. It comes from continuing to push through, especially when things get tough. So remember, it's not about how fast you go, but that you keep going. Your willingness to keep showing up for yourself and your dreams is what will ultimately lead you to success. And as we wrap up today's episode of Speak Up, we hope you found practical tips and inspiration for dealing with failure and setbacks. Remember, persistence over perfection is key. Keep taking those small steps, celebrate your progress, and surround yourself with positivity. You've got this, and we believe in you. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.